Remember Barbara Mandrell? Take a deep breath before seeing how she lives now. She stood at the very top of country music, adored by millions, showered with awards, and celebrated as one of the greatest all-around entertainers America had ever produced. And then, without warning, she vanished.
No scandal. No decline.
No goodbye tour dragging on for years. One night she was on stage, and the next she was simply gone. For decades, fans have asked the same question: what really happened to Barbara Mandrell? The truth isn't what most people expect, and by the end of this video, you may find yourself looking at fame, success, and happiness in a completely different way. Barbara Mandrell wasn't just famous. She was, at one point, the single biggest name in country music, a two-time Entertainer of the Year, a chart-topping singer, a skilled multi-instrumentalist, and the star of her own primetime television show. She had everything an entertainer could dream of. So when she walked away, still loved, still wanted, still capable of selling out arenas, it stunned an entire industry. People assumed there had to be a hidden reason: a terrible illness, a financial collapse, a secret scandal buried by publicists. None of that was true. The real explanation was far simpler and, honestly, far more admirable than anything the rumor mill ever came up with. To understand why she left, you first have to understand how completely music consumed her life from the very beginning. Barbara was born on Christmas Day in 1948 in Houston, Texas, into a household where instruments outnumbered toys. Her father worked as a police officer but lived for music on the side, and her mother played bass in the family band. There was no separating the Mandrell family from performing. It was simply how they lived. Before Barbara had even mastered reading a children's book, she was already reading sheet music. She picked up the accordion as a small child, then moved on to steel guitar, saxophone, banjo, and several other instruments, absorbing each one with an ease that startled the adults around her. By the time most kids were worrying about spelling tests, Barbara was already being paid to perform. The moment that changed everything happened when she was just 11 years old. At a music trade show in Chicago, she picked up a steel guitar and played in front of a crowd that included the well-known guitarist Joe Mathis. He was floored by what he heard from someone so young, and he invited her to join him on stage in Las Vegas. A year later, 12-year-old Barbara stood in front of grown professional musicians and held her own without flinching. From there, her career only accelerated. While still a teenager, she was sharing stages with legends like Patsy Cline, Johnny Cash, and George Jones as part of her family's touring band. She never really had a normal childhood in the traditional sense. Her classroom was a stage, and her playground was a tour bus. Given how fast her career was moving, what happened next surprised almost everyone who knew her. At 18 years old, right as opportunities were multiplying, Barbara walked away from performing entirely. She had fallen in love with Ken Dudney, a drummer who had played in her family's band, and the two married in the spring of 1967. Not long after the wedding, Ken began serving as a Navy pilot, and Barbara chose to step back from music so she could build a life alongside him. There was no farewell concert, no press release, nothing dramatic. She simply stopped, as though the years of professional performing had been a phase rather than the center of who she was. For a while, it looked permanent. She settled into life as a young wife, far from the spotlight, and seemed content to leave the stage behind for good. But there's a particular kind of moment that tends to reveal what someone truly loves, and Barbara had hers on an ordinary night at the Grand Ole Opry. She had gone simply to watch a show with her parents, expecting nothing more than a pleasant evening. Instead, sitting in the audience and watching the lights hit the stage, she felt something she couldn't shake. She realized almost instantly that she belonged up there, not down in the seats. She went home that night and told Ken she'd made a decision. She was going back. That decision led her to sign with Columbia Records in 1969, launching the career that would eventually make her a household name. It's worth pausing on how unusual this path was. Very few artists retire before they've even had their big break, only to return and become one of the biggest stars in their entire genre. But that's exactly the trajectory Barbara followed, and it says something about how deeply performing was wired into her. Even with a record deal in hand, success didn't come instantly. For years, Barbara toured relentlessly, recorded constantly, and gave everything she had to live performances, yet the chart-topping breakthrough she wanted kept slipping just out of reach. Musicians who worked alongside her knew exactly how talented she was, but commercial recognition lagged behind her ability. That finally changed in 1978, when Sleeping Single in a Double Bed became her first #1 hit. From there, the hits kept coming, including If Loving You Is Wrong, I Don't Want to Be Right, and in 1981, the now iconic I Was Country, When Country Wasn't Cool. That song alone became something of an anthem, cementing her reputation as one of the genre's defining voices. Her success in those years was staggering. In both 1980 and 1981, Barbara won the Country Music Association's Entertainer of the Year award, becoming the first artist in the award's history to win it 2 years in a row. That achievement alone would have secured her legacy, but television soon came calling as well. NBC gave her a primetime variety show, Barbara Mandrell and the Mandrell Sisters, where she performed music, acted in comedy sketches, danced, and hosted alongside her sisters Louise and Earlene. Audiences loved watching someone who seemed capable of doing absolutely everything well. But that success came at a real cost. Juggling a weekly television show with touring, recording, and family life left her exhausted in a way that fame alone couldn't fix. Even though the show was thriving and could easily have continued, Barbara made the choice to end it herself rather than let it damage her health or the quality of her work. It was an early signal of a pattern that would define the rest of her life. When fame and well-being came into conflict, she consistently chose well-being, even if it meant giving up something wildly successful. Then came the day that changed everything in a far more brutal way. On September 11, 1984, Barbara was driving on a two-lane highway near Nashville with 2 of her children in the car. A 19-year-old driver traveling in the opposite direction crossed the center line and struck her vehicle head-on. The young man in the other car died instantly. Barbara survived, but just barely, with a serious concussion, a broken thigh bone, a shattered ankle, fractured ribs, and significant knee damage. Her children were injured as well, though not as severely. In a strange twist that Barbara has spoken about many times since, she had introduced a new seatbelt rule for her family just hours before the crash, and had buckled herself in for what may have been the very first time purely to set an example. She has always believed that small decision played a role in her survival, even though there's no way to know for certain. Surviving the crash turned out to be only the beginning of an incredibly long ordeal. Her physical recovery stretched out over roughly a year and a half, moving from a hospital bed to a wheelchair to months of grueling physical therapy just to relearn how to walk normally. But the injuries that didn't show up on an X-ray were, in many ways, harder to overcome. She battled depression and serious memory loss in the aftermath, struggling to piece together parts of both her personal life and her career. To those closest to her, something had clearly shifted beneath the surface, even as she kept up the warm, gracious public persona fans had always known. As if the physical and emotional recovery weren't enough, Barbara also found herself at the center of a painful legal situation. She filed a claim connected to the driver's estate, aiming only to cover the substantial medical costs for herself and her children through available insurance. But parts of the media framed the story as a wealthy celebrity going after a grieving family, and that distorted narrative brought public criticism at one of the most vulnerable points in her life. Still, even during that dark chapter, there was a moment of genuine light. In 1985, while she was still deep in recovery, she welcomed her third child, Nathaniel, into the world. She has described that period since as one defined by extremes, the worst pain she'd ever experienced sitting right alongside one of the greatest joys of her life. About 18 months after the accident, Barbara made her way back to the stage, and to the outside world, it looked like a full-blown comeback. Her voice was still remarkable. Her instrumental skills hadn't faded. Audiences still stood and cheered. But those who knew her well noticed something different beneath the surface. For most of her life, performing hadn't just been a job, it had been the core of her identity, driven by a relentless internal need to prove herself again and again. After the crash, that specific hunger softened. The talent and professionalism were fully intact, but the urgency behind it had shifted into something calmer and more reflective. In 1990, Barbara opened up about all of it in her autobiography, Get to the Heart, My Story. It wasn't a typical glossy celebrity memoir. She wrote honestly about the crash, the painful rehabilitation, the memory problems, the depression, and the long road back to feeling like herself again. Readers were struck by how candid she was, and the book later became the basis for a television movie, giving even more people insight into just how close she had come to losing far more than her career. Throughout the 1990s, Barbara kept touring and recording, honoring commitments to the fans who had supported her for so long. But the motivation behind it had clearly changed. She was no longer performing because she felt she couldn't survive without the stage. She was performing because she appreciated her fans, valued the gift she'd been given, and knew people still wanted to hear her sing. That quiet shift in purpose was, in hindsight, the beginning of the final chapter of her performing career. That chapter closed on October 23, 1997, when Barbara walked onto the stage of the Grand Ole Opry House in Nashville for what would become her farewell concert. She was only 48 years old at the time, still enormously popular, still capable of selling tickets, and still wanted by record labels and promoters alike. There was no career-ending illness forcing her hand, and no falling out with fans. She had simply decided, on her own terms, that she had accomplished everything she'd set out to do in music, and she wanted to leave while she was still at the top rather than watch her career slowly fade. It's a decision remarkably few entertainers ever choose to make, since most hold on as long as the opportunities keep coming. What followed her retirement reinforced just how serious she was about closing that chapter completely. She sold her musical instruments, turned down reunion tours, and declined repeated invitations to return to the stage over the years. She briefly explored acting afterward but realized fairly quickly that it wasn't where her heart was, and stepped away from that as well. Even the massive log home she and Ken had built in Tennessee during the height of her career, one of the largest of its kind in the country, was eventually sold without hesitation. None of it seemed to hold her back. Fame, wealth, and the physical symbols of success were never what she'd been chasing in the first place. In 2009, the industry she had shaped for decades formally recognized her legacy by inducting her into the Country Music Hall of Fame, a fitting tribute to a career built on genuine talent and hard-earned success. But unlike many legendary performers who eventually find their way back for one more tour or one more special appearance, Barbara has remained firm in the decision she made in 1997. She has said plainly, more than once, that she doesn't miss being famous. So, what does her life actually look like now? Barbara has spent the years since her retirement focused almost entirely on the people closest to her, her husband Ken, whom she married nearly 60 years ago, their 3 children, and now their grandchildren. Her Christian faith has also remained a central part of how she lives day to day. In recent years, fans have gotten small glimpses into that private world, including a rare family gathering that brought together Barbara, Ken, their son Matt, her sister Earlene, and their mother Mary Ellen, who was approaching her 95th birthday at the time. It wasn't a red carpet event or a publicity moment. It was simply a family choosing to spend time together, which is precisely the kind of life Barbara set out to build when she walked away from the spotlight all those years ago. For anyone who has wondered whether she secretly regrets leaving or quietly longs for the applause she once had every night, the evidence points the other way. She doesn't come across as someone nursing old regrets. She comes across as someone who got exactly what she wanted out of life, even if it looked completely different from what the rest of the world expected of a superstar at her level. She has often said that every stage of life carries its own purpose, and that she has no regrets about trading a career for the years she got to spend fully present with her family. In the end, maybe that's the most striking part of Barbara Mandrell's story. She didn't lose her career to tragedy, and she wasn't pushed out by the industry. She chose, deliberately and more than once, to put the people she loved ahead of everything else the spotlight could offer her. Achieving that level of fame is rare enough on its own. Walking away from it voluntarily, with no regrets and no looking back, might be the far rarer accomplishment. What do you think about the life Barbara Mandrell built for herself after fame? Have you ever seen her perform live or grown up listening to her music? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed learning her story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.